As a trauma survivor, I have always been interested in resilience. But growing up, I believed it was something that you were born with. Then in graduate school, I learned that it was a quality that we all possess and a set of skills we can all strengthen. Most of my resilience has come from writing and seeing myself in new ways by confronting the stories I've always told myself. The more I did that, the stronger I became, and I've dedicated my life to helping others do this work. This podcast is for anyone who wants to understand their story and how to revise it, because when we do that work, we change the world. At the beginning of 2024, Ann Batchelder sent me a podcast pitch I couldn't refuse. After reading her memoir, Craving Spring, A Mother's Quest, A Daughter's Depression, and the Greek myth that brought them together, I was so glad I didn't. Ann is not only a talented writer and editor, she is a gifted speaker who's been on many podcasts. Her work has appeared in Insider Magazine, Newsweek, Hippocampus, the Linden Review, and the Rumpus. To learn more about her many accomplishments and all the interesting things she's up to, please see the show notes. During this episode, Ann and I looked at addiction and recovery through multiple lenses, explored some of the common traps writers face, and examined the myths we live by, both those that bring us solace and those that get us in trouble. Before we get to our conversation, I have a few questions for you. How much do you know about the myths your family lives by? Are there any you'd like to ditch? Is there a myth, book, or story that has served as a companion for your journey? And finally, what writing traps do you frequently fall into? I hope you'll ponder these questions as you listen along. Now let's get to my interview with Ann Batchelder. Hey writers, have you struggled to develop characters beyond a laundry list of physical traits, or do you fall into the tired cliches of stomachs that roil and boil, hearts that pound, and characters that look off into the distance, unsure what to do? Has a critique partner ever told you your character's motivations or actions don't make sense? Or worse, has an agent told you they just don't connect with your main character? Let's face it, developing great characters is hard work. It takes both artistry and an understanding of psychology to bring them to life and make their actions understandable. It's even harder when that character you're trying to describe is you. That's why I'm teaming up with Jane Friedman to teach the psychology of character development for memoirists on June 19th, 2024. During this 90-minute webinar, you'll discover the three-step chain of events that determines what your character does in any situation, investigate the role that core wounds, attachment styles, and inner resources play in shaping your character's personality, and find out how having your character act as if can help you limit backstory and start in the right place. Plus, you're going to learn so much more. Best of all, this webinar is only $25. You heard that right, $25. For that price, you can attend the live webinar, watch the recording, or do both, and get access to the webinar's workbook and my slides. So if you want to understand yourself better, write characters readers will fall in love with, and feel confident that you know how to do more than just craft tired cliches, go to janefriedman.com and click on paid classes, or make it easy on yourself and click on the link in the show notes. Well, hello, Ann. Welcome to the Writing and Resilience podcast. I am delighted to have you on.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. This is great.
Well, I really loved your book, and it was such a pleasure to read. And oh my gosh, this cover is also very beautiful. And what's interesting is that I have a page that is bookmarked, and the colors, for those of you who are watching this, if you are listening, you can't see that I'm holding up her book, and it has these beautiful, are these orchids?
Mm-hmm.
Orange orchid at the bottom, and it matches my sticky note, which was kind of fortuitous. Great. So your book is Craving Spring, A Mother's Quest, A Daughter's Depression, and the Greek myth that brought them together. What would you like us to know about your book?
The story is about a woman whose life is all of a sudden upended when her teenage daughter comes home and admits to severe depression, including addictive behavior and suicidal thoughts. So she is completely undone by this and starts to try to figure out, how could this happen? I thought our family was fine. When did this, problem start? What's wrong with me as a mother? What have I done wrong? And so she, in a desperate attempt to rescue her daughter, she starts looking into 12-step and therapy, and also reading some Buddhist literature, trying to understand what's going on. And she gains a lot of insight from all of those things,
Mm.
but she really finds her solace and comfort from reading a Greek myth about a mother-daughter story, which is the myth of Demeter and Persephone. So ultimately the book is really about the power of story
Mm.
and how we can feel seen when we read something that we can relate to, that we can understand. We feel seen, but we also learn what we need to change by reading a story like that. So that's kind of the message of the story. Well, there are many layers to it, but that's basically it.
Yeah, and I'm not a mother. I don't have children, and yet your book really hit me. And there are
Mm,
so many layers around recovery and addiction, which is something that plays a big role in my life and in my family. I mean, it's been a huge issue. Lots and lots of addiction just going through the generations, and then I've had my own recovery journey that I've been on, probably similar to the journey that you were on.
mhm,
And as I was reflecting on your book, this is something that I wrote down. There are stories we are living that we don't really know or understand. We just think this is what it means to be good or kind or right. And then there's the opposite.
mhm,
And your story delves into that. And what I really enjoyed about this, and we're going to talk about the myth. We are going to talk about that because I know that writers are going to want to know how you did that. So
mhm,
not just to know about it, but to know how you did that. So we're going to get into that.
mm,
But I want to begin with talking about how, so often, and we were talking about this before I hit the record button, we write about someone else, then we realize it's about us.
mhm,
And there is a way that these two characters, the mother and the daughter, are on these parallel journeys. And so, at what point in your writing process did you realize that was actually the story?
mm. I well, first of all, it took about 10 years to write this story. So it began when my daughter was in high school and college, and I started journaling a lot about what was going on because when I
Mm-hmm.
write, it helps me think. And as I was once I started taking some writing classes around this project, I wasn't really sure I was going to write a book, but all of my writing really was about what happened to her, how did that happen to her, what
Mm-hmm.
was wrong with our family, what was wrong with me, blah blah blah. But it was really not until I decided to put the book together, which was when the pandemic started. I spent about 3 years actually thinking, okay, if I'm going to do a book, let me look at this more deeply. And the more I
Mm-hmm.
started writing, the more I came up with questions about myself.
Mm.
So I think in the beginning it was like, oh, poor me, I have this issue facing me with my child who's depressed. How am I going to understand that? But then I started thinking about, well, wait a minute, who are my demons? And
Yeah.
why am I blaming myself so much? And why am I trying to fix all this? And what
Mm-hmm.
is that about my conditioning and my upbringing and my understanding, my society? What has brought me to this point where, what am I afraid of in myself? So
Mm-hmm.
once I started seeing myself in that way, the story just got much more interesting because I couldn't really assume what she was thinking, what was going on with her. I could
Right.
pretend to know, but I did know, and was able to unravel what was going on with me. So that's when it shifted for me, is when I started putting the book together and I started really thinking, oh, this is not about her, it's about me
Mm-hmm.
and what my journey is and what is my addiction. I don't have substance abuse issues personally, but I didn't understand that I could also be addicted to her recovery, which is kind of what the story is about.
Say more about that.
Okay. I, well, there's so much that I learned about when I first started 12 step. I
Mm-hmm.
know 12 step isn't for everyone, but I did go through that because she was going through that and I wanted to understand what it was about. So, of course, I went and thought I was going to learn how to help her. That's not what happens in an Al Anon meeting. You learn about yourself. But I think that I finally understood that the importance of taking responsibility without blame and shame,
Mm-hmm.
and how I wasn't at fault for what was going on, but I also was part of the family and could
Yeah.
contribute to the healing. And it was a lot of self-discovery that was necessary on my part to see where I fit in all this, and my relationship with my mother, my relationship with her. Why was I so focused on fixing what was wrong with her?
Yeah.
So the more I got into that, the more I realized that we're all on the spectrum of addiction,
Hmm.
that everyone wants things to work out the way they want them to. We all want our kids to be happy. We all want to be successful. We want to have health and fitness. We want things to work the way we want them to in the world. And when that doesn't happen, then we suffer because it's upsetting, and we look to ways to soothe ourselves somehow, sometimes not in a healthy way. And that's where I think we get trapped in our own addiction, our own attachment.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I think so many people come to recovery, whether it is 12 step or other kinds. If
Yeah.
you do not have a substance use disorder, but yet you are trying to support someone who does,
Mm-hmm,
thinking, I'm going to do this for them, and not realizing that addiction is a family problem. And you do have to look at yourself.
mm-hmm,
And, one of the things you said about addiction, and this is something that I learned in 12 step recovery, was the role of control. And so when we are afraid,
mm-hmm,
the default is to control, because we
mm-hmm.
think if we control everything, then, life will be okay. It'll turn out the way we want. And yet that often makes things worse. But
Mm-hmm.
also from a brain perspective, that hits the reward center, like, oh, I can fix this, I can fix this. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's one of the ways that people who maybe struggle with, I'm going to use a word and it may not be a perfect word, codependence,
Mm-hmm.
people pleasing, that
Mm-hmm.
is, something that happens. And I also like what Gabor Mate says. So he
Mm-hmm.
is a psychologist who
Mm-hmm.
deals a lot in addiction, and he talks about how, you know substance use is a way to alleviate pain.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for people who maybe do not have substance use issues, but are affected by them or are affected by the family myths,
Mm-hmm.
that's one of the things I really noticed in your book is, yes, we have this Greek myth, which plays a pretty prominent role, and you do it
Mm-hmm.
really beautifully and elegantly. But there's also the family myths that
Mm-hmm.
we live with that get passed down in these very subtle and unconscious ways that impact us and create pain. So
Yeah,
we find these really genius ways of getting out of pain.
exactly. And I think the other thing is our society tends to set women up to be perfectionists, especially
Yes.
mothers. And you have to be a good mother. Well, the flip side of being a good mother is a bad mother.
Right.
There's like nothing in between. So when my daughter was in so much pain, I just made the assumption, because of my upbringing and my conditioning and my
Mm-hmm.
society, that it must be my fault, because therefore I must not be a good mother. And so my investment in her recovery was partly because it's excruciating to see a child in pain, but
Oh,
also I
yeah.
wanted to redeem myself for not catching this earlier, or not knowing what to
Mm-hmm.
do. Or so I think a lot of that unraveling started happening the more I wrote the book, the more I started writing, the more I started digging deeper and deeper into oh, that's how I'm feeling about this. Well, where did that come from? And when was the
Mm-hmm.
first time I felt that? And I just started going back and forward in the book, trying to figure out sort of how I came to those assumptions, how I came to that pain, and how I was trying to resolve that pain by fixing whatever was going on with her.
I love that mystery component. Is the daughter going to find recovery? Is she going to have
Mm,
sobriety? But the deeper story, and I think the one that makes it really rich, is, why does this narrator do the things that she does? Why does she feel driven in these very powerful ways to
right.
to help her daughter in a way that we find out is not necessarily helping her? Like, that's part of the journey, is how do we figure out how
Exactly.
to do this in a way that does actually work? And
Well,
so,
that's what I was thinking. What I was going to say is that was I've said this before. I realized at one point that I was a junkie for regret,
mhm.
because if I could be at fault for what was going on with her. If I was powerful enough to do that, then I was powerful enough to fix it.
Mm.
So it still was this control thing of
Yeah.
feeling like, I must be able to be a good mom and fix this. So I wasn't willing to let go and let her be powerful in her own right, let her do her recovery the way she needed to. I mean, there was in the beginning, of course, when a loved one is in active addiction, you do have to step in, and there are times when you have to take an advocacy role and be much more
Mhm.
involved. But once they start recovering, once they start finding their own path, that's when it's important to step back.
Absolutely. And I love that phrase, a junkie for regret.
Mm,
Such a powerful phrase. And so you have done a lot of work on yourself. And I think before I want to get to that, I want to talk about one of the things that makes this powerful storytelling, which I think will also get us into this conversation around recovery. You were caught off guard as the mother
mhm,
of this daughter
mhm,
who had this addiction, didn't see it coming.
mhm.
You take us to the same place. We are caught off guard. Daughter comes home from school. We're like, oh, teenage problems.
Right, yeah,
Boom. I'm not going to give it away, but we're in the middle of something. And then we
right,
find out that it's worse. And
right.
you do that really well. So for people who are writers who are listening to this podcast, and you're like, how do I catch the reader off guard? Read this
Mm,
book because you do this in a really nice way. You take us into this moment. The storytelling is really beautiful, and you set us up for something that's going to be benign, but it's not.
mhm, mhm.
And I think that's your editorial prowess because you have also worked as an editor.
Mm. I think it's interesting because I think there are several layers to the revision or the editing part of that. But I think first of all, you're when I stopped just writing in a journal and I thought about writing a book, I realized I was no longer the audience. I had
Mm-hmm.
readers as the audience, so I wanted to take them along the same journey that I was on or that I had been on. You don't want to just give it away in the beginning. You
Right.
want to show the same emotion, show the same process that was happening at the time and not get ahead of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
There's too much reflection in the beginning. It's going to ruin the action and the momentum of the story, I think. And then the reader doesn't get to also come to their own conclusions or come to their own realizations or questions or that
Mm-hmm.
type of thing. So I think the first layer is getting to the truth of what it is you're trying to say. And then the second layer of revision or editing for me was how clearly am I writing this? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
is it understandable? And then finally is like how engaging is it? So what can help the reader feel engaged, more engaged, I guess. So I sort of went through those three different layers of revision and editing to help me.
That is so quotable.
Well,
Seriously, it
okay.
is. I love the three layers that you shared. It's so well put because that is really the way we need to think about the process is, first your truth so that it
Hmm.
feels emotionally right to you. Is
Hmm.
it clear? And then how can you engage the reader? And part of engaging the reader is making the reader do the work of
Hmm.
feeling for the characters, of figuring out what the problem is, of trying to solve the mystery alongside the narrator. If you as the writer spoon feed us
Hmm.
everything we need in terms of how people are feeling or what's going to happen next, we're passive vessels. We might as well be watching
Right.
TV.
Yeah, I mean, you have to trust the reader. The trust that the reader is smart, the reader is curious, the reader has their own questions. They're good, but to make it relatable to someone else, I think it's important to understand what you're trying to say in the first place.
Yeah.
What am I trying to say? Why would anybody want to read this? What are they going to learn from this? What did I learn from it? How did I learn from it? When did I learn from it? What was going on that what was that pivotal moment where
Mm-hmm.
I went from being a victim to being in my own power? And that to me was the critical point of the story when things started changing. So how did I get to that point? That actually happened maybe two-thirds of the way through the book. So, I was still bumbling along in the beginning of the book as and taking the reader for that ride, and then coming to a point of realization where things changed for me.
Yes, and I was glad that you took me on that ride and that you let me bumble alongside you and go, oh my gosh, what's going to
Yeah.
happen to this family?
Yeah.
So there are two lenses that you apply to this story. I mean, this is your personal story, but there
Right.
is the lens of recovery and the lens of the grief myth.
Mm.
And I am curious what you learned about recovery and how that influenced your writing process. And as we talk about this, I'm going to read something from page 112 of the book. Learning about Buddhism from the perspective of addiction and the 12 steps from the perspective of Buddhist philosophy brought new clarity. I began to see how all humans are on the spectrum of addiction, and as is often said at retreats such as this one, we are all just walking each other home, which is such a
Mm.
beautiful line.
Mm.
My curiosity is about what you learned about how Buddhism is related or influences or connects with the recovery process and vice versa, and
Hmm.
how all of this affected your writing process. And since we talked about this before the recording started, you are not an expert in Buddhism
Right.
or the 12 steps. Neither am I. So we're going to speak in I statements, but I'm really curious, how did all of that come together for you?
Well, I had been studying mindfulness for years and years, since like 2004. So I was familiar with Buddhist literature. It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't something that was new to me. I wasn't as familiar with the 12 steps. But what I learned from the 12 steps is the importance of being honest, taking
Mm-hmm.
responsibility for your actions, showing up. There were just a lot of things that were attractive to me about it. But it wasn't until I read a book by Kevin Griffin called One Breath at a Time, Buddhism
Mm-hmm.
and the 12 Steps, that all of a sudden I started seeing the the understanding about how in Buddhist philosophy, how we all have attachments. We
Mm-hmm.
all are not, they don't call it addiction, but we all are attached to wanting certain outcomes. And when we don't get those outcomes, we suffer. And the higher the stakes are, the more you crave your outcome.
Yeah.
If you're sick, you really want to be well. If you're having a wedding and it's a rainy day, you're upset. I mean, things that were maybe out of our control. But I think the point really is that we all want things. We all want things to work out the way we hope they would. And when
Mm-hmm.
they don't work out, that's causes a suffering. And
Yes.
so it's a similar thing when I realized that, oh, if we all have this attachment, then there's no us and them.
Mm-hmm.
There's no, all these people over here are addicted, and I don't have a substance abuse program, so I'm over here. We're all in the soup. We're all in the same
Yeah.
situation in a way. And I think that really helped me, I guess, look at it from a more philosophical, universal kind of a humanist thing, as opposed to someone who
Mm-hmm.
is sick with a disease.
Yeah.
So to me, it took it out of that category and made it
Mm-hmm.
much more applicable to anyone, all of us. And I don't know if that explains it, but that's kind of where I saw the parallels were really helpful to me. And the mindfulness of going back to staying in the present moment, the same thing with, like in 12 step, there's an expression about you don't want to be future tripping or
Mm-hmm.
going down a rabbit hole or having anxiety about something you can't control in the future, nor do you want to worry about whatever you did wrong in the past. It's about staying in the present and doing in one step at a time, one
Yeah.
day at a time, so that you can, just face each moment. Well, the Buddhism is the same thing. It's all about staying, mindfulness is all about staying in the present moment. And the more we can address our thoughts and our behavior to responding to what's in front of us as opposed to reacting based on our past or our future, then I think we get to a better place
Mm-hmm.
of being genuine with ourselves and with other people.
Yeah. And what I hear in this is Suffering is a universal experience. And when we think about addiction from the disease model, which some people feel like that's really important to them to see it as a disease. And so we're not going to get into
No,
is this the right way to look at it or not?
right,
But when you use the disease model for talking about addiction and you talk about someone having an illness, they are separate from you.
right,
They are different.
right.
But when you look at it from the perspective of attachment, and I have attachments, and my attachments cause me suffering. These attachments cause you suffering, and maybe
Mm-hmm,
they're different attachments, but the suffering
mm-hmm,
is the same.
mm-hmm.
There is a way that you can experience equanimity, this feeling of sameness amongst all of us.
Right.
And that is a powerful way of developing compassion.
Well, I was just going to say that's the missing link is compassion.
Yeah.
And when we set it up as an us and them kind of a situation, I didn't want my daughter to think that she was the only sick person in the family,
Mm-hmm.
or I didn't want to assume that there weren't things that I needed to work on as well. So I think that having compassion for yourself and then having compassion for other people is really the gateway to healing. And that's what happens when you read a memoir. You feel seen, you feel somebody understands me. Well, that's compassion. That's making that connection.
And that is the
So
gift that memoirists give because we are putting language to other people's experiences and we are
right,
allowing them to be seen. And
exactly.
so that is one of the gifts of your book. And so we've talked about the lens of addiction and
Hmm.
how that influenced the storytelling and how that allowed you to have compassion for yourself. But I
Hmm.
also want to talk about this Greek myth because the Greek myth is on the cover. So
I
let's go get
know.
into it. When did you know this was part of the framework of your story? And how
Mhm.
did including it impact the way you told the story or the way you saw it?
Okay. Well, first, as I said before, when I read this myth, it was the first time that I really felt seen because here was this ancient mother her daughter had been captured and taken to hell. And she goes nuts. She goes crazy. She drops all of her responsibilities. All she can think about is rescuing her kid. And I went, oh, that's me. I get it. But also she has to learn things. Once I started actually reading the myth more carefully,
Mm-hmm.
I realized it wasn't enough to just say, oh, I'm fine to be obsessed about my kid because this ancient Greek mother was too. No, she had to learn things and she had to develop and she had to transition from raising a child to allowing her grown-up daughter to be independent. So there were many, many things that I could relate to while I was reading this. But it really wasn't again until I started trying to put the book together. I mean, I knew about the myth and all those things, and I thought, I really want to include this in my book. And I thought, well, maybe not everyone knows about this myth. Maybe I should write an introductory chapter and
Mm-hmm.
explain it. So when I started trying to do that, I thought, well, I don't want to just write Homer's myth. I want to write my version, what I imagine. So once I started trying to imagine the myth from my perspective, from a 21st century perspective, in a way, I started thinking of it more in short chapters. And then I started thinking, well, if I can sprinkle this through the book, then I started thinking, well, every chapter about myself needs to relate to her story as
Mm-hmm.
well. So the structure of using the reimagined myth throughout my book forced me to be much more judicious about what I was going to put in about myself because I
Mm-hmm.
wanted each thing I wrote about myself to relate to the arc of the Greek myth, which did. I mean, I realized the reason I used it was because there were so many parallels that I found to my life with her and with what I was experiencing that I was able to weave those two together. But the structure gave me a direction and also a criteria
Mm-hmm.
for each of my chapters. They had to relate in some way to whatever was going on with that section of the myth. It just kept it much tighter.
And
It's a
that's,
short book. I mean, it's not a
it
very long
is.
book. Yeah.
I'm going to flip to the page. I was surprised by that. It's 166 pages.
Yeah, it's very short.
Yeah, and you do that really well. And I love how I personally loved how you meted out the story so
Hmm.
that we were getting this little bit, then we learn about your life. Because if I had had to hold the entire story in my head, I wouldn't have had the same connections
Hmm.
that you had.
Exactly.
So I think, breaking it up was a great strategy. When you were thinking about this and you rewrote this myth, did you just write the entire myth and then figure out, like, okay, I'm going to break this up into these chunks and then see how it goes together? Or did you write it in chunks and say, how does this relate to my story? How did that work for you?
Interesting. I don't think I wrote it all at once. I think what I did was I really sat down and went line by line through Homer's myth and tried to imagine what was really going on. And then, I mean, then I would sit on it for a while and then think about
Mm-hmm.
it for a while, and then I'd come back to it. So what I didn't write the whole thing out at the same time, but as I took each little section, I really thought about, well, so what happened here and what was going on with Demeter and, well, wait a minute, what was going on with me and so I think I took it in sections slowly. And sometimes I went back to a chapter, a Demeter chapter, and embellished it more, or took it to in a different direction in a way, because I learned something later in my book that I wanted to go back and
Mm-hmm.
address. So it didn't just, I mean, none of this goes in a linear fashion. Recovery is not linear. None of this is linear. So I think there was a lot of, I guess, stumbling around before I really kind of hit on what I wanted.
Yeah, and that's a great answer. And what I hear is slow, deliberate, meandering,
Hmm.
and that it requires a lot of patience, right? And that you
Oh,
didn't have to
years.
do it
Yeah.
all at once. And yeah, so writers, I want you to hear again, she said
Mhm.
it took 10 years to do
Yeah.
this. So if you're in the middle of writing your memoir and you're like, OMG, this is taking way too long, give yourself a little grace.
There were times when it was painful to write some of this. And there
Yeah.
were times when I had to step away, sometimes for months. I had
Mm-hmm.
to walk away from it and I didn't want to really go back to it, or I had to think about it some more, or, it was not like I just sat down and cranked it out because there was some deadline. It was much more of a process of recovery in writing as I was learning. I mean, there were moments when I was started writing that I realized, oh my gosh, I didn't know that was happening with me until I
Yeah.
wrote it, until I tried to get through that chapter. So there's a lot of self-discovery in the process of writing, which has to do with what you were asking before about resilience and recovery. To me, recovery is about being able to handle a crisis, or,
Mm-hmm.
rise to an occasion in the middle of a crisis. But resilience to me is the practice of recovery over a period of
Yeah.
time. And so I think it's the practice, the writing practice, the, the mindfulness practice, all those things I think are a process that take time.
Yeah. And as we practice them, we build the tools that allow us to be able to bounce back.
Right. And even the next time stronger and the next
Mm-hmm.
time stronger. But it's not a one-time thing. It just has to keep building over time. So,
Yeah. And there's an alchemy that happens in the writing process. Until you do it, you don't realize that when you write it, you're in it. And you are making these discoveries about yourself that so many people I've worked with will say, "Oh, I can write a memoir. I've been in therapy for years." I was
oh,
also one of those people. I was like, I could tell you my whole life story and let me
sure.
give you all the insights. You go to write it, it is totally different. It is
Hmm.
not the same experience. And so, yeah, allowing for all of these practices to marinate, for the story to marinate so that you can really discover what it means is so important. And that's what I love about how you handled this journey with figuring out how to structure your book. And I have one more structure question, and then I'm going to ask you something about
Yeah.
backstory,
Okay.
which is also every writer's Achilles heel,
Right.
going on with the Greek mythology, motif. But I recently interviewed Jennifer Linden, and she wrote this book, American Breakdown, which is about her chronic illness that she has. And
Hmm.
she has this chapter where she talks about the difference between the hero's journey and the heroine's journey. And here's a very quick and easy way to think about it. The hero's journey is let's go off and slay the dragon. It's about
Hmm.
going off and catching something out there. The heroine's journey is more about the inward journey. Let
Hmm.
me embrace and discover something within the darkness. As you
Right.
were writing this, did you think of this as the heroine's journey, or did you have a framework in mind as you were conceptualizing the book?
Yes, I did see the Demeter story as an internal struggle, a heroine journey, as that kind of a process for her. And then, of course, when I followed that arc, which was, you come up against obstacles, you go backwards, you go forwards, you're trying to understand something about yourself. So of course I was going through something similar. But yeah, I think both my story and the Demeter story were probably the heroine journey
Mm-hmm.
as well. I did see that. I was conscious of the fact that it was much more internal rather than external,
Yeah.
which was more my interest anyway. So I think many memoirs who are written by women are it's about that similar kind of journey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's important just to consider that there are different ways. And I'm going to share a link in the show notes to what the heroine's journey is because people might not know. I'll also share one for the hero's journey in case people are like, what is that? I don't
Right.
know.
Yeah, yeah,
I'll
right.
share both so that people have it. Yeah. And so thinking about how to navigate this journey is really important. And our backstory provides context for why we do what we do.
Hmm.
And I work with a lot of writers who will sometimes give me pushback when I say, don't put it in the beginning, or at least don't put too much of it in the beginning. Like, yes, maybe something does belong, but a very common thing that happens in early drafts is let me give you my life story up to this point when the story will begin.
Right.
And your opening is 150 pages long, and your book is like 400 because you have too much in the beginning. You show some major restraint, let me just say, because to me, one of the big backstory things that you share, you have this backstory chapter at page 128 where you get into this miscarriage and some of the other things that influenced the story you were telling yourself, which of
Hmm.
course influenced how you interacted with your daughter and the things that happened in the book. How did you show that restraint, and how did you make the decision to put this key bit of backstory so far into your narrative, which I agree
Hmm.
with? I think it was the right placement.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, first of all, as far as backstory, I mean, most editors of magazines, whatever, will often skip to like the third chapter or the
Yes.
third paragraph that somebody sends in because that's when it gets started. So
Mm-hmm.
it's really important, I think, to know where to start and often to start with a scene or with action or with something that's going to grab the reader because we don't live in the 19th century anymore. We have short attention spans. Readers
Yes.
have short attention spans. So the whole idea of giving a backstory in the beginning of a novel doesn't quite work now the way it
Yeah.
used to. But I do think that not only is it important to know when to put it in, but is the backstory relevant? And that's the really important. If you want to kill your darlings, you may have a great backstory that doesn't really fit in your book, and the detour is going to make it harder for the reader to keep the momentum of the action and the story going. The backstory you're talking about later in the book was an aha moment for me
Mm-hmm.
as I was writing the book. It wasn't until I got toward the end of my manuscript that I thought, oh, that's why I was so obsessed
Mm-hmm.
about needing to rescue her, needing to make sure she was okay. I mean, it wasn't just that it's a normal problem if you have someone who you love who's in addiction, but I was so obsessed about it and I didn't understand that. Even though I'd
Yeah.
been through therapy, I'd been through all these things
Mm-hmm.
before, I hadn't really dealt with the grief about that miscarriage that
Yeah.
then, but so when I realized that I didn't understand that until I was, almost done with the manuscript and working on the tail end of it, that aha moment was something I wanted to give the reader.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted them to have the same kind of aha moment that I had later. And so that's why I kept it at the end.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple things I want to highlight that you've said. One, in your writing process, the aha happened later in the writing process.
Hmm.
So for a lot of you, that's going to be a clue. Like, where in your writing process you have an aha is going to
Hmm.
clue you in on how far into your narrative might this piece of backstory belong. So
Hmm.
that's one thing to think about. And also, you don't want to lose forward momentum. Every time you put in backstory, you stop the forward momentum of your book.
Hmm.
And you knew that you had this aha. And to enrich the aha and to make it make sense, this piece of backstory moved us along further because it helped us understand what the aha was, why it was necessary, and then it allowed you to get to the next thing that you needed to confront in the book.
Right. Because I put it later, I didn't have to do a lot of explaining.
Yes.
That was the other advantage of putting it later, was that not only was it a surprise to me and therefore the reader, but I didn't have to over explain
Mm-hmm.
why it was important or what, it's obvious when it happens, how it fits in, because I've already told the story, most of the story up until that
Right.
point.
You do not have to develop the characters
Right.
again and
Yeah.
who these
Yeah,
people are. It's like
exactly.
we know who they are. And
Right.
also, sometimes when you juxtapose things, especially if a lot of the main pieces have already been developed, just juxtaposing these two things together allows the reader to do the work and connect the dots
Right.
in a way that does not require as much reflection.
Hmm.
So, this is a way that you can allow the reader to do work. So, how are you going to figure out how Anne did this? You're going to read her
Hmm.
book and you're going to go to these
Right.
pages that I have mentioned so
Yeah.
that you can see exactly how she did that. Well,
Actually, I didn't do a lot of reflective writing until the last third of the book.
mm-hmm,
I mean, even though I put in backstory early on, I didn't, I just sort of, it was more of a statement as opposed to a reflection.
yes.
And I think that if you're writing backstory, if you just offer the information as opposed to all of your thinking about it, then
Mm-hmm,
the reader can make those connections. So again, it helps you not stay bogged down with the backstory if you're just
yes.
giving facts. And then later in the book, you can do some reflective thinking, but let the reader do the reflection.
Yes, I love that.
Yeah.
Another quotable moment.
Mm,
So, I always ask three lightning round questions. I'm going to ask them to you because we could be here all day. We could talk about
okay.
so many different things with your book, but everybody has limited time. And I know you have other places to be, and so do I, even though I would love to be here forever.
Right.
But what is the best piece of writing advice you've received?
I think there were two pieces. One was asking myself again and again, what am I trying to say?
Mm,
What do I want to say? And and thinking that I've written that, and then I go back again and say, what really do I want to say?
yeah.
What's the point here? And I think that was very helpful to just keep that front and center. And then again, then the other part is using your story as a way to connect with your reader
Mm-hmm.
versus just telling a tale or a series of events. It's like how can I connect with the reader? What are the universal themes, or what are the pain points that the reader might be coming to pick up this book and say, "Oh, I want to hear about that."
Yeah.
So making those connections, and almost as again as a what do I want to say and how am I going to connect with the reader,
Mm-hmm.
are the two things that I think really help me.
Beautifully said. And your book is really about how you nurture your resilience. I mean, we see it all the way through, but if you could give people just one or two very quick ways that you nurture your resilience now after
Mm.
compiling all the wisdom of this experience and what you know, what are you doing?
Well, first of all, I never think of myself as finished in terms of resilience or recovery or any of those things. I see it as ongoing journey of self-discovery.
Yes.
And so that's very exciting to me. But to nurture that, I would love to say that I meditate every day for 20 minutes. I don't. I would love to say I have a yoga practice. I don't. What I do every night is I get in our hot tub and I look at the sky and I have a quiet moment with myself and I have a
Nice.
conversation with my soul and I think about my connection to nature, or I think about, you know, what I'm grateful for, or
Mhm.
where I need to ask for help, or any of those kind of things. And I think that connecting with the true nature of who I am and reminding myself in that moment of really being grateful for the joys and the challenges of my life is a way for me to nurture that resilience and that sense of self-discovery.
I love that.
Yeah.
And I also love that you were so honest in saying, here's what I would love to tell you, which is
Yeah.
based on what everybody says I'm supposed to do.
Yeah.
Here's what I actually do.
Yeah. I don't write every morning either, for that matter. I'm a binge writer. I write when I feel like it, or I write when I'm upset, or I write when I get inspired. If I see a beautiful piece of art or hear some beautiful music, sometimes that will inspire me to write, but it kind of just comes when it comes.
Thank you for
So
busting that myth of the writer who writes every single day, because most of us don't. I mean,
hmm
yes, you do need to develop a writing practice, especially if you're a new writer. It's like
hmm
exercising or anything else. Habit is important, muscle memory is important. And once you have that, going with your flow is also important, and recognizing you do not have to do it perfectly, and every day
Right.
is perfect.
And you can ask for help, and that's the thing. The other thing I learned from 12 step and from recovery is the importance of community, the importance of asking
Yes.
for help, the importance of staying honest with yourself.
Hmm.
I mean, not just 12 step, but also the Buddhist philosophy, all that, it's about not feeling like you're alone. And that's the
Hmm.
beauty of memoir, is that it's a way for women, especially who write, to share their wisdom so that readers can discover their own wisdom.
Yes.
And that's, to me, that's a lovely gift that we give each other.
We heal and we write in community. That
Yeah,
is how we get it done.
right.
Well, you have this beautiful book, Craving Spring. Going to hold it
Thank
up
you.
again for those of you who are watching this. What are the best ways for people to learn more about you, buy your book, and connect with you
Mm.
online?
I think the best way, I have a website. It's www.annbatchelder.com. And that's got everything in there in terms of finding my book and reading reviews and podcasts and everything. It's all in there. But if you want to buy the book, it's available at bookstores and Amazon. So
Lovely. And if you missed that, all of this will be in the show notes. So fear not, you can find it. Thank you so much, Anne, for being on the
thank you.
podcast. It has been delightful to talk with you, and I'm deeply grateful for this conversation and for the opportunity to read your book.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Are you a writer who struggles with doubts? Do you wonder if your stories are good enough? Do you wish you had some simple tricks that would make the writing life just a little bit easier? Become part of my Writing and Resilience community by signing up for my newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, 5 brain hacks that will supercharge your productivity, creativity, and confidence. The link is in the show notes. That's it for today's episode. Before you leave, I would love your help spreading the word about this podcast. You can do this in a few very simple ways. Click on the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, then leave a 5-star review. You can also let me know what you think or share ideas for the podcast by connecting with me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or through my Writing and Resilience newsletter, which you can have delivered directly to your inbox.